Well, hello, friends and fellow Bible readers. Today we are going to dive a little deeper into the rest of Genesis. So we just went through Genesis 1 through 11, and now we're going to go to 12 through 50. There is a significant break between chapters 11 and 12, all within the same book, of course, all part of this Genesis origin story thing that we talked about. But it moves to a different kind of story after Genesis 11. So when we pick up in 12, we start reading about what we call the patriarchs or the ancestors: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then sometimes Joseph gets thrown on there. I kind of think he should get thrown on there, personally. This is a family tree. Abraham is the father of Isaac, who's the father of Jacob, who's the father of Joseph. And these guys are kind of central in the story of God's people. You see them referred to not only here in Genesis, but throughout Scripture, Old Testament and New Testament, as uh, these beginning figures, forefathers, patriarchs, ancestors of the faith. And so it the rest of Genesis gives us a little bit about each of their lives. Um, we read about sex and drunkenness and incest and wrestling with God and power and family fights and forgiveness. These guys just have their ups and their downs, and God walks with them the whole time. And as we look at our lives and just the world in general, isn't that kind of the human story? Right, this story that these stories that we read are the memory of a people. When a good Jewish person says, "Who am I?" they go back to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. That's who we are, all of us. Uh, we have our ups and downs, and God walks with us anyway. And so in that, it's kind of a weird book. It's not, if you hadn't read it before, there's a lot of stories in there you've probably never heard read from the lectern in church, right? About some of the more uh, R-rated stuff, right? A quote from my wife. She says, "Genesis, sometimes R-rated, sometimes a snooze fest." Good point. Uh, and this is kind of the central part of it all, right there at the beginning of Genesis. Now the Lord said to Abram, who would become Abraham, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." This is God's covenant, God's promise to Abraham. And uh, there's sort of two elements of this promise that undergird the whole rest of the story of Genesis. Uh, the two promises are a promise of land and descendants. Land and descendants. And the rest of Genesis has this sort of flowing through land and descendants. And eventually this gets even into Exodus and Moses with the Israelites. They're looking for the promised land so that they can have descendants in that land. Land and descendants for God's people. This is sort of the eternal promise. And so we also read though that their election, their being chosen by God, is for service, not privilege. It's not like, oh, we're God's people, we can do whatever we want. No, it's, I will bless you and make your name great so that you can be a blessing. Blessed in order to be a blessing, to be God's people, uh, to be at the front of God's mind. And then Jesus goes and says to the woman at the well, John 4:22, salvation comes from the Jews. And so what that gets us into, and we're jumping into the New Testament here, but as Christians, even we find uh, our ancestors in faith not to be those people who came around at the time of Jesus, not just to be them, but to go all the way back to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. And so one way that we see all of this all of this happening with the land and the descendants is in Genesis 22. You have read or you will read about how God commands Abraham to take up his son Isaac to the top of a mountain and sacrifice him. And it's this really kind of strange, disturbing story. Um, but we end up getting to this point where God says to Abraham, no, stop, you don't have to sacrifice him, because he was about to do it. And it turns out God doesn't need a dead Isaac. God needs a faithful Abraham, right? God needs a faithful Abraham. Abraham needs to learn something. God does not need to learn something. And so the question is, will Abraham seek to kind of possess this promise on his own terms, or will he let go and let God? And that's kind of parallel to the cross, right? If we jump forward, God's son actually does die. It's this idea of obedience to God. We see this in Jesus and in Abraham, obedience to God, even when it doesn't make much common sense. And because God's sort of reversed there, I don't think God ever had any intention of Isaac being killed. But because of that reversal, then the promise of descendants goes on. And then we go to the next chapter, and without getting too much into the weeds here, Abraham decided he wanted to overspend to bury Sarah, his wife, in the land. And he doesn't have to, but he does, to say this is going to be an important spot for us, because God has promised us land and descendants. So it's moving forward. Then God's people throughout their lives have this promise in the back of their hearts, especially as we read through the Old Testament: land and descendants, land and descendants. And the rest of the Torah is kind of them trying to figure out where they fit in this story. And so that's Genesis. That wraps it up for us. That's the origin story of the Bible. Congratulations, you've read through your first book of the Bible. Now on to Exodus.